Hey everybody, Jason Burmis here, and we've got a very special episode for you today. I've been focusing a lot on children and the education system lately because I'm telling you right now, they're coming for your kids, they're coming for your kids, they're coming for your kids, and it goes well beyond just the masking of children and well beyond even these physical mandates that they are going to try and impose on your smallest of children. In fact, it is actually a global agenda to have a unified techno-fascist education system under the guise of these unions. And if you read this article, there's actually a unity of more than 200 of these unions globally under a plan that's really been in the works for decades now via globalization. And we are joined by the man, the myth, the legend behind schoolworldorder.info and the book School World Order, John Klizek. We've had him on before, but he has put together an absolutely fantastic, very well researched, and very well written article, NEA World Order, which really defines how the system has been taken over by these techno-fascist organizations, NGOs, and really the Rockefeller Foundation keeps popping up in particular. So from there, let's talk about this article, your work, how you got involved. John, take it away.
Hey, thanks for having me back, Jason. So how I got started on this was similar to how I got started on the last article that I talked about on your show. And that was I was visiting with Charlotte Thompson Iserbeat, who wrote the foreword to my book. She also wrote The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America. She worked in the State Department, was elected local school board, blew the whistle on this thing called Project BEST, Basic Education Skills Through Technology. And that ties into this thing called UNESCO Study 11 that we talked about last time. And in this pile of documents that I've collected from her place, there was also a file that had a lot of stuff on the NEA and a little bit on the AFT. And I had noticed that the NEA had an interesting connection to Project BEST and then by extension, UNESCO Study 11. And one of those connections had to do with the NEA used to have this thing called the Department of Audiovisual Instruction. Okay, and just for a little history on that, before I tie it into Project BEST, they have been working on programmed instruction, the behaviorist method of psychological conditioning through computers since at least the 1960s. So in 1960, there was a project called Educational Implications of Automation, and that was funded by IBM with an unrestricted grant, and it was partnered with the NEA's Department of Audiovisual Instruction, or the acronym is Dewey. And then that same year, they published this source book called Teaching Machines in Programmed Instruction. And that was partnered also with the Navy, the Air Force, and the Human Resources Research Organization of the U.S. Army. It's a long anthology of all sorts of behaviorist research, including B.F. Skinner's research and Sidney L. Pressy's research. These people, B.F. Skinner is the founding father of operant conditioning, but also he is basically the godfather of teaching machines. And back in the day, they would be these little analog machines. Sidney L. Pressy was the founding father. He came up with some testing machines prior to B.F. Skinner. And so they include a bunch of that research in that source book. And then there's also the editors for that book. One guy is Robert Glazer, and he's another one of these rock stars in behavioral psychology and also programmed instruction. He won the E.L. Thorndike Award and the James McKean Cattell Award. And those two individuals are key proponents of the behavioral psychological method, in particular the stimulus response method, at Columbia University prior to B.F. Skinner. So B.F. Skinner basically built on E.L. Thorndike's puzzle box experiments, which were his little rat mazes and stuff like that. And he just took that and applied it to humans through the teaching machine. James McKean Cattell was the head of the department where E.L. Thorndike was at, and James McKean Cattell, he was one of the first PhDs from Wilhelm Wundt, who founded the first psychological laboratory in the world. That's where you get your stimulus response psychology. So it's a straight line from Wundt all the way down to B.F. Skinner. Okay, so Dewey later, the Department of Audiovisual Instructions, it becomes something called the Association for Educational Communications and Technology. That was the main contractor for Project BEST. Now, the interesting thing about it is what I found in these documents that Charlotte had was that there was some confusion about whether or not the AECT was still part of the NEA. And so the contract, although, and you can see these actual documents, there are screenshots of them on the article, but I linked them at archive.org as well. I scanned them in and I linked them.
Basically, you had this situation where there was questioning over where the addresses exactly were and whether or not they linked up. And there seemed to be some shady situations and backdooring between these organizations through not only their online presence, where they said there was a mistake in the paperwork, but then that same mistake wasn't on the actual paperwork, correct?
Absolutely, exactly, right? And so one is filed with HHS, one is filed with the NEA, and then when people contacted Nybeck at the AECT, he said that, well, they held them, even after they were technically separate from Davy, they had an office at the NEA until 1970, late 70s, and then there's conflicting reports about whether it was the late 70s or early 80s as well. So pretty much all the way up to the point where they had contracted with Project BEST, there was still close connections. And they only moved right down the street. And Nybeck said that even after he had said that, you know, there's no office at the NEA, that they still consult together. And then another connection is that Donald P. Eli is one of the, he was one of the oversaw parts of Project BEST. Well, he was both NEA and AECT. Actually, he's the one that changed the name from Davy to AECT.
And the importance of all this is that this is the infrastructure that's being built up through our Defense Department, really, throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, and into the 80s, which then kind of unifies not only with tech, but these globalist foundations, you mentioned UNESCO especially, and they kind of take hold into the tools that our children begin to learn with. And this now stretches in through the 80s, 90s, and into present day, where you have this new vast, virtual learning and no longer in-person learning. So because they've taken hold of all these different organizations and been basically the pipeline for the tools of education, their end goal is this idea of a one global education for everybody through these tools. And although you don't ever mention it in this article, I think if you go along this path of thinking, eventually it's all AI that's teaching your kids through a screen in a separate individual area. And that's not something you really hint on, but if you continue to read these things, and especially when you get to the end of this article, which is extensive, of all these different learning organizations that are online from Khan to others, they have sort of these tech oligarchs behind them, and it is the motion in which all of these organizations are pushing, even if COVID 1984 and all its variants were to disappear tomorrow, correct?
Yeah, there's several quotes to bring it up to date. There's several quotes from the NEA where they say that, look, even after the pandemic, so-called, is over, whenever it is, they say we're not going back, right? We're going to be using at least a hybrid or a blended learning model. So distance learning is where everything is remote. Blended is where hybrid would be where half the school is half the attendance is remote and half of it is in person. So you would stagger people from in person to at home on every other day. And then the blended learning would be where you're in the school all day, but everything is mediated through a computer. And so they have been building this infrastructure since the 60s. So what is that? 60 years at least. And then, another thing that got me started on the article was also, back in, I want to say, was it March, there was the report that the NEA and the AFT got more heat from the press, were petitioning the CDC to basically roll back their school reopening guidelines. They were going to allow basically full in-person learning at, quote, any rate of community transmission, as long as there was mitigation procedures and things like that. And one of the things that the NEA asked for was the CDC had also rolled back and said,
hopefully we didn't lose him, folks. Hopefully we'll have him back in a second. There you go. Go ahead, John. It looks like you're back.
Am I back? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So they wanted to move back the 6 foot distance to 3 foot distance, which is totally
and completely arbitrary. Oh man, we're losing him. I hope we don't lose him. I hope we get him back here, because this is an extensive article and it's an extremely important topic. And one of the reasons it's so important is because it illustrates how much they want to be involved in our children's not only learning, but their behavior, and then harvesting the information about that behavior, mostly through remote situations. And it looks like we're getting him back now. We lost you in the beginning of there. You were talking about the 60s, 70s, and how they've built this infrastructure. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I apologize.
No problems.
I'm on the road, man. So they wanted to roll back. They wanted to. So we had the 6 foot social distancing guidelines. They wanted to reduce that to 3 feet, which is totally absurd and ridiculous, because, right, empirically, a virus travels the distance it travels, right? And, other countries already had different distances as well. I think one of the FDA guys recently, it was a Gottlieb, right, said that the whole 6 foot distancing was arbitrary. But in the meantime, right, we're being told that, we have to trust the science, and we have to basically just follow whatever magical dictates they want to give us. But the NEA is here, they're not the public health authorities, but they're saying, well, we want the 6 foot distancing. Well, what that would effectively do is, if there's 3 foot distancing in a classroom, you could pretty much put every student in a desk and everybody could fit in the classroom, so you could have full in-person learning. But if you reduce it to, or if you extend it back to 6 feet, you're going to have to alternate desks, which is going to require that you only have half the attendance in person, which means you're going to have to use the hybrid learning model, which means you're going to have to use partial distance learning technologies on alternate days, which means you're going to have to continue to contract with the ed tech companies that are facilitating the modern adaptive learning software, which is the modern version of the Skinner box teaching machine. So in other words, right, that lobbying for this policy change effectively lobbied for a situation where all their investments on the ed tech infrastructure would get to be wedged in, at least, if not indefinitely.
Absolutely. Now, let's talk about some of the tech oligarchs that you talk about in here, but especially David Rockefeller, because I think that's important. We talk about the kids, and so many people are talking about their education system. And again, I've been focusing on it because of the masking of children. Now, isn't it ironic that you have the Rockefeller Foundation document Operation Lockstep talking about these masking of the population? And this is now a key feature in this federal funding and these quote-unquote global guidelines. Meanwhile, David Rockefeller appears again and again and again in this article for not only funding it through his private foundations, but people who will later work for these foundations outside of Rockefeller himself. And I think it's also important that you point out the Office of Naval Intelligence in this, in some of these behavioral studies and white papers, because Rockefeller himself, outside of the skull and bones connection you make to his family with Percy and others, was also a member of naval intelligence. I mean, take on that large piece of history that most people have no idea about.
Yeah, so you're referring to the NEA had a global curriculum that they designed called their Cardinal Principles. And actually, this one is in about 76. And so these are the Cardinal Principles revisited. So they're the original Cardinal Principles go back even further. But if you look at, there's the pre-planning committee and then the panel, the two different boards for the Cardinal Principles curriculum. David Rockefeller is on there. And as you mentioned, right, his Percy Rockefeller is connected to was a member of the Order of Skull and Bones. So Rockefeller is affiliated with the Order of Skull and Bones. But there's another Bonesman on the list too, and that's McGeorge Bundy. And McGeorge Bundy was also the guy who, when he was dean at Harvard University, he financed B.F. Skinner's book called The Technology of Teaching, which was basically his seminal work on how to build and implement the teaching machines that I just mentioned, which were which the NEA would have been also prototyping with IBM in the early 60s. And by the way, with Skinner's early prototypes, they were built by IBM, and then some of them also Eastman Kodak. Okay, another person on that panel is Secretary T.H. Bell. He would have been, at the time, he wouldn't have been the secretary because it wasn't the Department of Education yet. It was still an office under the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. But he was the commissioner, okay, which was basically like the secretary. But he becomes the head of Project BEST, right? And so there's another connection back to the program instruction with the NEA, Project BEST, and then UNESCO Study 11, okay? And then another interesting connection there is out of Project BEST, you get this thing, one of the largest charter schools, virtual charter schools in the world. It's called K-12 Inc. It was created by Secretary Bill Bennett, who took over after T.H. Bell. And Mary Hatwood Futrell, who was a president of the NEA, she sits on the board or had sat on the board of K-12 Inc., right, which is a public-private virtual charter school that the NEA always rails against. And so, right, you have this union, this public union that tends to, at least rhetorically, rail against privatization, but there's connections to the people who are running the public-private ed tech partnerships from both directions. And so there's also connections to Rockefeller in terms of the AFT in particular. So one of the founding members of the American Federation of Teachers was John Dewey. And John Dewey was funded by Rockefeller money on several occasions. The Lincoln School, which basically uses his pedagogy at Columbia University, that was set up with Rockefeller money. And then also Dewey was funded at the University of Chicago with Rockefeller money as well. But then you also know that David Rockefeller, and I've written on this as well. There's another article on Unlimited Hangout on the AFT that I wrote previously. But David Rockefeller, he also set up the Trilateral Commission. And Albert Shanker, who was one of the longest running presidents of the Trilateral Commission, he was a member of the Trilateral Commission. And I've got the document in there, and he says that he was at a meeting with an American meeting of the Trilateralists, and he was also meeting with the head of IBM and, quote, bankers. Okay, and so there's IBM right back in the loop. And then one more connection is that one of the people who was in those CDC emails where the AFT and the NEA were petitioning to change the COVID protocols, her name is Marla Uccelli Kashyap. I believe I'm pronouncing that right. She used to work for the Rockefeller Foundation. She was also she currently is the assistant to the president at the AFT, and she's directly in those emails petitioning the CDC to basically roll things back so all this ed tech can get wedged in.
And again, this globalism is what's driving all of it, and the legitimization of bodies like not only the United Nations, but the corporations that are surrounding them. I've been covering this a lot this week, but you're now seeing op-eds saying that Amazon should have a spot on the UN, Facebook, Google, they should have spots on the UN. And then you see what's happening in Australia. I'm not sure if you've seen this yet, but they've actually granted Facebook, Twitter, and Google together to have an adjudication panel of truth. So at the same time they legitimize globalism and the United Nations, they're outwardly legitimizing these companies and corporations. And you talk about not only the Twitters of the world, of Jack Dorsey and Eric Schmidt being behind Khan, but all these other types of apps. And we have openly in New York the reimagination of education under the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Bill Gates did a Zoom call with Mario Cuomo, not Mario, Capo Cuomo, Andrew Capo Cuomo, the old governor, and you had Schmidt do the same thing because he was going to get the smart city aspect of that. I mean, once again, these same names come up. The infrastructure is not only building back better, but it's reimagining everything under the guise of globalism and these big companies helping along the way. Now, you've talked about the history of this. IBM also comes up quite a bit. And obviously, if anybody out there is not familiar with history, they were instrumental in the tabulation machines the Nazis used to regiment what would become their victims in concentration camps. And here we are coming full circle, and you're seeing their name pop up again and again in this education system. Speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, IBM is one of the most horrifying companies I've come across in my research, and they pop up all the time. I mean, Google and Microsoft are bad enough, but IBM, I remember growing up, you didn't have, IBM was not quite as popular commercially, when Macs and micro Windows and stuff got popular, but they were always around. And so, an interesting connection to what you just mentioned, right? So the IBM system comes out of the Hollerith punch card system, which they use for the census first, right? So it's basically to track populations for basically population management. And then later they would tabulate the concentration camp data, which wasn't just like, did we execute somebody or work them to death, but it was also eugenics data, okay? And so if we're talking about transhumanism being the extension of eugenics, right? It was Julian Huxley, who was president of the British Eugenics Society. He's also the first director general of UNESCO. He coins the term transhumanism, basically says that we can still do old school eugenics through selective breeding and biological selection, but actually the best way to control evolution is through, he says, quote, through machines and ideas. And so that's integrating machines with the body, and then the ideas has to do with the psychological conditioning we're talking about through the data, right, through the algorithms. Okay, and so if you think about the modern census system on steroids, it's basically social credit, and it integrates that psychological behaviorist data. And so one of the ways to facilitate this is, well, through the vaccine passports, first of all, right? And so that blockchain app on there, right? As many scholars like Naomi Wolf have pointed out, once you have that blockchain platform on there, you can load any other type of data you want onto it. So it'll start with just your vaccine record, in other words, your public health record, but later it'll be your mental health record. They can put your education data on there. They can put your workforce training data on there. They can put your criminal background on there. And IBM is a key is invested in impact finance, which is one of the financial means of facilitating the social credit system. So impact financing in education, sometimes they call it pay for success. Basically what it does is they're going to give out loans, not like traditionally for like emerging markets and things like that, but like to help with poverty, to help with sustainability, to help with gender equity or racial equity, right? And
can I just stop you right there? So I was at the Iowa Davenport school board meeting where these people were all masked up. We had to wear masks to go in. It's the first time I've worn a mask in like 6 months, and immediately put it around my chin, and I sat in the front row to tape these parents who were each given 2 minutes by these authoritarians, and then their mics were cut, okay? And before I got there, the two things that I had to watch, okay, it was all about sustainability, right? And then it was all about equity and education. Obviously, we're in these schools. So the first one was all about sustainability and recycling and them receiving an award. And again, it's we're wasteful. We need to fix this. Humans are wasteful. The only thing I could stomach through the entire presentation of, again, they got their 12 minutes, was the fact that I saw some kids smiling in the slide from 2006 because they weren't wearing masks. Okay? Total garbage. Then the next thing was about the Special Olympics. Okay? But it was really, and again, I want kids with disabilities, learning disabilities, physical disabilities, or otherwise to have opportunities as well. But this was to streamline that with all students, and it was all about equity, and they had these cards about inclusion. This was a 30-plus minute presentation about inclusion I had to sit through. Meanwhile, parents were cut off after 2 minutes. Anybody can go watch that part of it. And then their issue was completely unaddressed. Your kids will remain masked even if you don't want them to. Everybody who wasn't there to give some bullshit presentation other than one childless man who spoke first and couldn't even go over the talking points for more than 60 seconds about how the CDC recommends we stay safe by masking kids, okay, was outraged and wanted their kids unmasked, and they just ignore it. This is the new globalized school system. It is authoritarian dictates behind closed doors. It is distance learning. It is global curriculum. It is inclusion. And it is essentially what you just mentioned, transhumanism through the fourth industrial revolution that you mentioned so much in this article.
Yeah, and you just brought to mind, I just remember, so check this out. So we used to get these emails. You know, I think people know that I teach college, community college. And we get these emails from this department or office, and we used to be called the Department or the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And then they added, just the other day, they added another word to this title. You know what it is? Compliance.
Oh, compliance.
What does inclusion and compliance have to do with each other? If you're inclusive, that means that, right, everybody can come in, right? If compliance means exclusive, if you do not comply, you are not included, right? So this just gets at the Orwellian nature of the language you're talking about, right? They're talking about
at the biggest moment of human segregation in history, at the biggest moment of global human segregation, not based on your skin color, not based on your gender, not based on your religious beliefs, but based on how you acted to authoritarian global dictates. And then they put compliance in that. It is almost unbelievable, but it shows you the Orwellian nature and danger of ever allowing a system like this to come into full fruition, because eventually the people will be worked out. The AI will be programmed. Your child will be forced to sit in whatever cubicle or device or headset they decide to put on them, and they'll be taking any type of physical inoculations, shots or injections, pills, you name it, that the state dictates. This is the Aldous Huxleyan nightmare come to life.
Yeah, and he was Julian's brother, right? And so everything in that novel it's not a fantasy novel, it's a science fiction novel. And I have all of his nonfiction. And in his nonfiction, he literally says stuff like, there's one article, one essay called A Note on Eugenics. And there's several others, but he talks about we need a scientific or intellectual aristocracy, which is basic, and then he also says we need a scientific caste system, right? So both of those things together. And if you've ever read Brave New World, that's literally what's in the novel, right? The world controllers, and then you have all these different castes, right? And so that brings us back to this whole idea of compliance and social credit. So starting with the vaccines, right? And we know that the bottom line is ultimately about compliance, because look, if the vaccine works, then you don't need me to take it if you have it.
Well, right? We can't even say we're on YouTube. I don't know. Apparently, Grimace can come down from McDonald's land, yeah, and just give vaccines to everybody. Everything's going to be okay. Everything the CDC said is true. Everything the FDA says is true. We're not telling you any medical advice. I'm sorry for my friend who may have misspoke.
I thought we were on the fin.
We're on it all. We're on it all. Listen,
I apologize.
I'll admit it's crazy. I even had to jump in there in the listen, man. Let me just state for the record to my Orwellian masters over at Google, YouTube, NASA, the NSA, Alphabet, all of you. I believe that natural immunity disappeared in 2020. I think that you should shoot me up with everything that you absolutely desire. I also believe that the flu disappeared for the first time in human history for over a year. And I like the fact. In fact, let me just say this. I bask in the fact And I love the fact that the United Nations is caught up in so many underage sex scandals with children. I think that they should direct me. I think it's great that the people at the United Nations generationally have trafficked in kids and recently been caught raping children as young as 13 officially. I think that's awesome. I think it's great. I think we should listen to everything they say. And by the way, I think that we should erect statues to David Rockefeller on the altar of globalism as we slaughter our children for his pleasure, for his ghost pleasure. I believe all of that.
And talk to your doctor, right? Talk to your doctor. Don't take medical advice from us. Talk to your doctor, right? So I'm just, I'm flying by the seat of my pants.
I get it, man. With all that said, we've been going for a half an hour. Why don't you tell people not only where they can find this article, which I think is extremely important, obviously very, very well researched and very well documented, but how they can get your book and how they can be involved in your current work and get a hold of you, because you're also on the Twitter at Professor Taoist and so much more. Let the audience know.
Okay, yeah, so you can go to my website at schoolworldorder.info and you can get the book from there. There's a link to Trying Day books. It's also on Amazon, but obviously, better for us and better to not feed Amazon if you don't have to. So go to the website and go to the link there. I'm on Twitter. I'm building a little YouTube page and BitChute. I probably run my mouth too much on my own YouTube. So just go to the BitChute before they get rid of that thing too, the YouTube. But it's there until they throw me off. And then I have a database where I'm putting all of these documents that I got from Charlotte that she took out of the Department of Ed. And she's got a lot of other rare documents that I have as well. And it's in a 3D map, right? Visual maps, got notes, links, files and things like that, summaries of what's in there. So basically it's a nice way to sort of just all the connections I'm throwing out to kind of visually see how they go together and to access some of these documents that you can't get anywhere. That is behind a paywall. It's only $5 a month. It really helps me if you can support me in that way. That way I can teach I teach 6 classes. I have 120 students. I teach English rhetoric, which means I actually have to read papers. I can't put stuff in a Scantron or whatever. So you're talking, thousands of pages, and I read all of them and I put comments on all of them. So all my research and my media stuff gets done in the wee hours of the morning. So if you can support me a little bit, I can do this a little bit more frequently. Whitney Webb is waiting on the next article still. So those are the main ways to support me. And that's where you can find me.
All right, brother. Well, let me tell you, great article, very well sourced. I think more people have to be aware about this danger. Don't get me wrong. Masks are a big issue. The coming boop mandates, big issue. Even critical race theory and the division of people, big issue. But this is a lasting issue that all of those are really just a small part of. And unless people understand that, we're not going to be able to combat it. And they're going to keep offering us these solutions that drive our kids into a globalized AI system of tyranny. So I thank you for your work, and I'm so glad to have people out there in the education industry, if you will, or in the intellectual community that are telling some truth. So you keep it up, my friend.
I appreciate it, Jason. Hey, next time let me know when I feel terrible, man. So just let me know on YouTube next time. So
No. Hey, you've been killing it, man. Like, this was a great piece. I think a lot of people need to be aware of this work, and they're not, right? Believe me, I talk about globalization and all these things a lot, but when it comes to, this plan that's been around for a long time and the mechanisms in which it works. When you talk about an institution of over 200 unions that this has reached out to globally and interjected into, and that's just a passing almost line in a much more extensive article, it's extremely important for people to have those moments of clarity where they're like, wow, this is going on, and it does have reach, and there are a lot of names, and there are more than one avenue. It's more than just Bill Gates, right? It's more than just Google. It's more than fake Facebook whistleblowers out there. So once again, my friend, everybody check him out. He's at Professor Taoist out there, schoolworldorder.info. We'll see you on the flip, all right?
Yep.
All right, brother. Guys, you know how to support this broadcast. Down below are the links. Everything from Rockfin to the GoFundMe. I think that was a great interview. I think it is a better article. Don't get me wrong. I'm glad we get to chop it up. But when you want something that is extremely well-sourced, Whitney Webb's UnlimitedHangout.com, you really can't beat it. And John Kleizek has given you a very, very important, well-sourced article that more people need to realize is a tool to fight back for your kids because they're coming after them. Guys, it's not about left or right. It's about right and wrong. I love you, and I'll see you on the flip side.